There are muscle cars everyone knows. And then there are the others, the ones almost no one ever saw, the ones that never appeared in ads, the ones that were never meant to be popular. Cars that were born in very specific moments, with very specific goals, and that, for some reason, ended up being completely different from everything else. So, in this video, we're diving into the lesser-known side, the rarest muscle cars ever created, and some of them will make you look twice. 1967 Shelby GT500 Super Snake. This car wasn't built to be just another muscle car. It was built to prove something. And that changes everything about how you see it. Because at first glance, it might look like just a more extreme version of the Shelby GT500. Same aggressive body, same attitude, the same foundation that already commanded respect on its own. But this car was something else. Much rarer, much more absurd, and in a way, much more unnecessary. Because the Super Snake was never intended as a normal production model. Carroll Shelby used it as an experimental car, a brutal showcase of what was possible when there was no need to be reasonable. And that's where it gets interesting. Under the hood, it didn't have just any V8. It carried a 427 V8 derived directly from racing, based on the engine used in the Ford GT40. Officially, it produced around 520 horsepower, a completely insane number for a street car in 1967. And that made it almost ridiculous for its time. It wasn't just fast, it was too fast. But there's one detail that makes all of this even more fascinating. This car wasn't built just to show off power. It was also used by Goodyear to test high-speed tires. During those tests, the car exceeded 170 miles per hour, something almost unreal for a muscle car of that era. And that places it in a completely different category on this list. Because we're no longer talking about a car that's rare just because it sold in low numbers. We're talking about a car that almost didn't exist at all. Today, its value is practically impossible to define. As a one-of-one piece, its price depends on context, provenance, and auction conditions. But it's considered one of the most valuable Shelbys ever created, with estimates easily exceeding $1 million. And once you understand its story, it becomes clear why. The Super Snake wasn't built for the masses. It wasn't even built to be logical. It was excess, an experiment, a one-time insanity. And that is exactly what makes it one of the rarest classic muscle cars ever created. 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. This car looked like just another Camaro, but it wasn't. And the most curious part is that almost no one at the time understood what they were actually buying, because on the outside, there was nothing exaggerated. The same aggressive lines, the same low stance, the same iconic design that defined late 60s Camaros. There were no clear signs, no warnings, but underneath, everything changed, because this didn't carry just any V8. It had a completely different 427, an all-aluminum engine derived directly from racing, originally built for the track, not the street. Officially, Chevrolet rated it at around 430 horsepower, but in reality, the true number was much closer to 500, and in 1969, that was insane. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, because this car existed for a very specific reason: the famous COPO program, an internal system that allowed certain dealerships to order special configurations outside of the standard catalog. And thanks to that, some dealers managed to create something completely out of the ordinary. The ZL1 was one of those cases, a Camaro that shouldn't exist, but did. And here's the contrast. Because even though it was one of the most extreme muscle cars ever created, on the outside, it was almost discreet. It didn't scream, it didn't demand attention, but it could destroy almost anything in a straight line. And that came at a price, literally. At the time, the ZL1 cost nearly twice as much as a regular Camaro. It was so expensive that many dealerships struggled to sell them. The result? Only 69 units produced, and many of them took time to find buyers, something that seems impossible today, because now it's one of the most valuable Camaros ever made. Well-documented examples can easily exceed $500,000, and some have reached even higher numbers at auction. And once you understand all of this, it starts to make sense. Because this car wasn't built to be popular. It was built to be extreme, hidden, expensive, and completely unnecessary. And that's exactly why it became one of the rarest and most desirable pieces in the world of muscle cars. 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona. This car didn't look like it was built for the street, and in reality, it wasn't, because the Daytona was created with a single goal: to dominate NASCAR. And that changes everything. From the very first glance, it feels different. That extended front end, almost exaggerated, and that massive rear wing that looks like it came straight off a race car. This wasn't designed for style, it was designed for function. Every line, every piece was built to cut through the air as efficiently as possible at high speed, and it worked. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because to compete in NASCAR, Dodge was required to build a street-legal homologation version. And that means this car had to be sold to the public. Just think about that for a second. A car designed to exceed 200 miles per hour on the track, barely adapted for normal road use. And under the hood, it didn't disappoint. Options like the 440 Magnum V8 and the legendary 426 HEMI pushed power to another level, officially rated around 425 horsepower in HEMI form, with a brutal direct delivery, built for real high-speed performance. It wasn't agile, it wasn't practical, but in a straight line, and especially at top speed, it was something else entirely. In fact, the Daytona became the first car in NASCAR history to break the 200 miles per hour barrier, and in 1969, that was simply absurd. But here's the defining contrast, because even though it was an extremely radical machine, it legally existed for the street, something that today would be almost unthinkable. And that's reflected in its production. Around 503 units were built, just enough to meet homologation requirements, and nothing more. And that makes it something very special, because it wasn't created to sell, it was created to win. And today, that carries enormous weight. A well-preserved Charger Daytona can easily exceed $300,000, and HEMI versions can go far beyond that. And now I want to hear from you. Out of everything we've seen so far, which one feels more extreme? The absolute insanity of the Super Snake, or this Daytona with its pure racing purpose? Let me know in the comments. 1970 Plymouth HEMI Cuda Convertible. This car doesn't seem that rare until you look at the numbers, because at first glance, it's just another Cuda, aggressive, low, with that classic early 70s muscle car stance, muscular lines, strong presence, everything you'd expect. But here's where everything changes, because this combination barely existed. A convertible with a HEMI engine. And at the time, that was completely out of the ordinary. Officially rated at 425 horsepower. But, as you already know, those numbers were conservative. In reality, the true output was significantly higher, with a brutal direct delivery, hard to control if you didn't know what you were doing. This wasn't a gentle car. It wasn't comfortable. It was pure excess. But here's the interesting part. It wasn't meant to be rare. It just didn't sell. The context explains everything. 1970 was essentially the last peak moment for the most extreme muscle cars. Insurance costs were rising, regulations were tightening, the market was beginning to shift, and a convertible with a HEMI was expensive, impractical, and too radical for most buyers. The result? Just 14 units produced. 14. And that places it in a completely different category. Because this wasn't a planned limited edition, this was a combination that simply had no demand. And that's why today, it's one of the rarest and most valuable muscle cars in the world. The contrast is brutal, because visually, it's a striking car, yes, but it doesn't look unreachable until you understand what it really is. A well-documented example can easily exceed $1 million. And at auction, some have gone even higher. And when you see it that way, everything makes sense. Because this car wasn't built to be exclusive, it became exclusive by accident. And that is what makes it even more special. 1969 Dodge Super Bee A12. This car didn't look special, and that's the trick, because unlike others on this list, It didn't have a glamorous story, no radical design, no luxury angle. It was the opposite, direct, simple, and brutally honest. It wasn't built to impress in showrooms. It was built to dominate on the street. Dodge basically stripped away everything unnecessary and kept what mattered: performance. The design made that clear. Matte black hood with a functional scoop, no extra trim, no attempt to look refined. It looked like a garage-built car, but straight from the factory. And that's exactly what it was. Under the hood, the legendary 446 pack, 3 carburetors, around 390 horsepower. A setup built to deliver power aggressively, almost instantly. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't progressive, it was violent. Throttle response was immediate. The car reacted with no filter, and that made it perfect for drag launches. But here's the interesting part. Even though it doesn't have ultra-low production numbers like others on this list, the A12 version itself is much rarer than it seems. It was a limited run, built for a very specific kind of buyer, the one who wanted to race, without paying for luxury, without caring about comfort, just performance. And that creates a strong contrast, because while other cars were rare due to exclusivity, this one was rare because of purpose. It didn't try to be elegant, or sophisticated, or even balanced. It was a tool, and today, that's exactly why people value it. A well-preserved Super Bee A12 can range between $90,000 and $180,000, depending on originality and documentation. It's not the most expensive, but it's one of the most authentic. And now I want to know, does this raw, no-compromise approach make it more interesting to you? Or do you still prefer something more exclusive, like the HEMI Cuda? Let me know in the comments. 1969 Pontiac GTO Judge Ram Air 4. This car looked like just another version of the GTO, but it wasn't. And that's where everything begins, because when you hear the Judge, you think of something flashy, almost exaggerated, bright colors, decals, attitude. It felt more like a marketing move than anything else. But there was one version that changed everything, the Ram Air 4. On the outside, it still carried that classic GTO presence, muscular proportions, sharp lines, a car that already looked powerful. But nothing prepared you for what it really had, because under the hood, everything was different. A 400 V8 Ram, Air 4, officially rated at around 370 horsepower, but in reality, significantly more. This wasn't just another engine. It was one of the most aggressive street setups Pontiac ever offered. A more radical camshaft, better airflow, components built for real performance. And you could feel it. This wasn't a smooth car. It wasn't easy. It was demanding. Power delivery was sharper, more abrupt, almost uncomfortable if you didn't know what you were doing. But that was the point, because this wasn't a GTO for everyone. It was for those who knew exactly what they wanted. And here comes the contrast. Because while the standard Judge was visual, flashy, almost playful, this one was serious, rarer, more extreme, more focused. And that shows in the numbers. It's estimated that around 700 to 800 units were built with the Ram Air 4 package, a very low figure compared to other GTOs of the time. And that makes it something completely different. It's not just another muscle car, it's a version that almost went unnoticed, but today is one of the most valuable. A well-preserved example can easily exceed $120,000, and in some cases, much more. The 1971 Plymouth GTX Hemi. This car felt like the end of something, and in reality, it was, because at first glance, the GTX still looked like a classic muscle car, big, solid, with that imposing presence Plymouth was known for. Heavier lines, less aggressive than before, but still full of character. But behind that, everything was changing. 1971 wasn't 1969. Regulations were tightening, insurance costs were rising, the market no longer wanted the same things, and Hemi engines just didn't fit anymore. And that's what makes this car so unique. Under the hood, the legendary 426 Hemi V8, officially rated at 425 horsepower, one of the most extreme engines ever offered in a production car, with a brutal, direct delivery. No compromise. But here's the contrast. This level of power no longer had a place. It wasn't practical. It wasn't efficient. And fewer people were willing to pay for it. The result? Very few were sold. It's estimated that fewer than 30 HEMI-powered GTX units left the factory in 1971. Fewer than 30. And that wasn't a strategy. That was the market speaking. Because this car wasn't created to be rare, it became rare because the world was changing. And that makes it even more interesting. It doesn't represent the peak. It represents the end, the final moment where you could still buy something like this, before everything became more controlled, more regulated, more rational. And when you look at it today, that matters. A well-preserved 1971 Plymouth GTX Hemi can easily exceed $200,000. And, in some cases, much more, precisely because of what it represents. It's not the flashiest, it's not the most famous, but it's probably one of the most symbolic, because this car isn't just rare, it's the end of an era. 1967 Chevrolet Corvette L88. This car didn't look that powerful, and that was completely intentional, because if you looked at the official numbers, everything seemed normal. Chevrolet rated it at around 430 horsepower, the same as other big blocks of the time. But that wasn't true. The L88 was something entirely different. Under the hood, it carried a 427 V8 that was essentially built like a race engine, high compression, reinforced internals, designed to perform at the limit, not to be comfortable. In fact, Chevrolet did everything possible to make it unattractive to the average buyer. No air conditioning, no radio. It wasn't even meant to run on regular fuel. This car demanded high-octane gasoline, constant maintenance, and a driver who truly knew what they were doing, because in reality, we're talking about well over 500 horsepower, and in 1967, that was completely out of control. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. This car wasn't built for the street. It was built to compete. Chevrolet knew the Corvette had serious track potential, and the L88 was the way to push it to the extreme, while still keeping it technically street legal. And because of that, they tried to hide it. They made it uncomfortable, expensive, impractical, all to prevent people from buying it without understanding what they were getting into. The result? Only around 20 units produced in 1967, a ridiculously low number. And here comes the contrast. Because visually, it looked like just another Corvette. No dramatic external differences, nothing that screamed what it really was. But in reality, it was one of the most radical cars on this entire list. A true race car, disguised as a street car, and today, that makes it incredibly valuable. A well-documented Corvette L88 can easily exceed $1 million at auction, and some have gone even higher. Because this car wasn't built to please or to sell, it was built to win, and that is what makes it so rare. 1966 Dodge Coronet HEMI. At first glance, this looked like just another car in Dodge's lineup. Simple lines, subtle design, almost understated compared to more aggressive muscle cars. There was nothing that screamed, "I'm fast," but underneath, it was a completely different story, because this was one of the first cars to receive the legendary 426 Hemi in a street version, an engine that, until then, was deeply tied to racing, and suddenly appeared in a car that didn't stand out. Officially, 425 horsepower. In reality, much more. Power delivery was brutal, direct, with no filters. This wasn't an easy car to drive, not even close. It was heavy, demanding, and had a response that could surprise even experienced drivers. But here's where the story gets interesting, because in 1966, this kind of engine was still something new to the public. There wasn't a strong HEMI culture yet. It wasn't a legendary name, not yet. It was simply too much, too expensive, too extreme, too unnecessary for most buyers. And that showed directly in the sales numbers. Just over 100 Coronet units were built with the HEMI engine, a very low number, especially for a car that, on the surface, didn't look special at all. And there's the contrast. Because this car didn't look exclusive. It didn't look rare, but in reality, it was one of the purest. No strong marketing, no iconic image, just a brutal engine placed inside a body that didn't justify it. And that makes it even more interesting today. A well-preserved Dodge Coronet Hemi can easily exceed $150,000, with properly documented examples reaching even higher figures. It's not the most famous, but it's one of the most honest, because this car didn't try to impress. It simply was more than it seemed. 1969 AMC AMX/3. This car doesn't look like a muscle car, and that's where everything begins. Because at a quick glance, you might think it's European, low, wide, with proportions much closer to an exotic sports car than to a late 60s American machine. And yet, it is, or at least, it tried to be. This car wasn't born as a traditional muscle car. It wasn't built for the general public. It wasn't designed for mass production. It was something far more ambitious. AMC wanted to change its image. It wanted to prove it could compete on a completely different level. And this car was the statement. Mid-engine, yes, mid-engine in an American car from that era. A 6.4-liter V8 with around 340 horsepower, mounted behind the driver, something completely unheard of in the United States at the time. And that changed everything. Weight distribution, handling, the way the car moved. Nothing about it felt like a traditional muscle car. This wasn't a straight-line machine. It was built for corners. And in 1969, that was simply too far ahead of its time. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because even though the project was ready, even though the car worked, even though it had real potential, it never made it to production. Costs were too high, the market wasn't ready, and AMC simply couldn't take the risk. The result? Only 6 prototypes were built. 6. And that places it in a completely different category. Because this car wasn't rare because it sold poorly. It was rare because it never truly had the chance to exist. And here's the final contrast. Because while every other car in this video represents extremes within the muscle car world, this one represents something else entirely. An idea that didn't fit, a path that was never taken, a vision that arrived too early. And today, that makes it almost impossible to replicate. Each of the few AMX/3 units that exist has a nearly incalculable value, with estimates easily exceeding $1 million, depending on condition and provenance. But beyond the price, what really matters is what it represents. Because this car isn't just rare, it's a what if. And when you put all these cars together, you start to realize something that isn't obvious at first. Rarity doesn't always come from the same place. Some were born as experiments, others as competition tools, others simply were too much for their own time. And now, I want to hear from you. Out of everything you've seen today, which one stands out the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy these kinds of rare cars, you need to watch this video about the rarest American wagons of the 1960s, because there, you'll find cars that, even though they seem completely different, share the exact same essence: rare, forgotten, and far more interesting than they appear. I'll see you in the next video.